Crusaders had successfully defeated the Turkish army of Kiliç Arslan at Dorylaeum, but their leaders feared another ambush. Instead of following the most direct route to the Holy Land, they opted for a more circuitous path that would take the whole procession across the Anti-Taurus mountains. Compelled to travel in single file, it took them 3 weeks to cross the mountains. And the worst was yet to come. Already exhausted, they headed down onto the arid plains of Pisidia and 90-degree heat.
The land was deserted, waterless and uninhabitable. We suffered greatly from hunger and thirst and found nothing at all to eat.
More than 500 of both sexes died at this time, prostrated by suffering. Most serious of all, their trusty steeds, companions in battle, on whom their masters depended for their own safety, and whose glory should be seen in prancing hoof and gleaming teeth, gave way like common beasts of burden.
After months of this tortuous journey, there was one notable casualty. Godhilda, the wife of one of the commanders of the crusade, Baldwin, the Count of Boulogne.
Godhilda was a very, very wealthy woman. She would have held estates and had finances that Baldwin, as her husband, would have had a route into. If she died, these would go back to her family. He wouldn't have access to her. They would stay with her bloodline. Her death means that his chances of becoming rich when he went back home had gone. His mindset would change. He was now potentially on the lookout for lands, for territory, for wealth of his own. Within a day or so of her death, his policy became one of acquisition and greed.
The chroniclers make no mention of his grief, only that Baldwin took a few hundred knights and left the main army on a solo mission. If he was to make up for the loss of his wife's wealth, the easiest course would be to seize a city of his own. 100 miles to the east was the perfect target, Edessa.
Edessa is a wealthy city. It generates its own income through metalwork. It's a very fertile region. It's very close to the Euphrates River. It's also on the trade routes. So you've got spices and luxury cloths coming across from the east, passing through it, and then going to the Mediterranean for further trade. It's a really, really good spot for Baldwin to base himself.
The problem for Baldwin was that Edessa was not in Muslim hands. It was a Christian city that had held out against the Turks. But the people of Edessa had grown weary of constant attacks by the Muslims. When news spread that a great Crusader prince was close by, the citizens pleaded with their governor Thoros to invite Baldwin to come to their aid.
The governor of the city was a Christian Armenian called Thoros. He was a feeble old man, without child of either sex. He was a useless overlord. He was unable to protect his citizens from wrongs or to procure them relief from the dangers of attack from these cursed infidels.
Baldwin's help would come at a price. He would protect Edessa from the Turks in return for the keys to the city. Thoros naively promised to make Baldwin the new ruler, but only after his death. The old man then sealed his own fate by adopting Baldwin as his son. For Baldwin, Thoros' death could not come soon enough.
Baldwin discovered evil counselors in Edessa. Traitors who plotted with him to have Thoros murdered and who promised to hand Edessa over to him.
Thoros realized too late that he was to be betrayed. He ran for his life.
He took a rope and let it down from the tower. But immediately his destroyers shot him down into the middle of the street. And and cutting off his head, they carried it on a spear through the quarters of the city for everyone to mock.
It's not a good start for crusading ideology, it has to be said. This is not a great moment in the idea that Christianity is going to come to save Eastern Christendom from the threat of Islam. The reality is that Baldwin has come with an eye to gaining territory, and I think he's prepared to remove physically and politically a figure who's Christian from power to get his own territory.
If there had been no Islam in that world, but you had had Eastern Christianity, which you had, after all, before the rise of Islam, exactly the same thing would have happened, but they would have had to find a different ideological coloring for it. They probably would have said, these are not proper Christians, we're the true Christians, like religious fundamentalists of all hues say. So, from that point of view, many Christians in that region also regarded the Crusaders as essentially Christian fundamentalist barbarians from the uncivilized lands of the north.
As Baldwin celebrated his new lordship of Edessa, 150 miles to the southwest, the main Crusader army arrived at the great walled city of Antioch. Since the time of the Apostle St. Peter, it had become a thriving Christian city. But in 1085, the Turks had seized control. This was a prize second only to Jerusalem, a prize worth dying for.
I think the Crusaders want to take the city for a whole range of reasons. First and probably foremost is strategic. Antioch is literally the gateway to Syria and the gateway to the Holy Land. If they leave the city behind them, their route for escape and certainly their route for resupply and reinforcement is going to be cut off. Spiritually, it's almost the equal of Jerusalem in many ways as a goal, because Antioch was, in Christian tradition, the site of the founding of the very, very first Christian church by St. Peter, the Apostle of Christ. So this gave it a real spiritual power and a spiritual cachet that I think the Crusaders were very empowered by.
The majority of Antioch's inhabitants were Armenian and Greek Orthodox Christians. Their Turkish rulers granted them total freedom to worship, but this was not enough for the Crusaders outside the city walls. They wanted to remove the Turks from power and return the city to Christian rule. But taking it back wouldn't be easy. It wasn't only Christian chroniclers that recorded the tale of the bloody struggle for Antioch. Ibn al-Athir traveled far and wide collecting tales of the great Muslim heroes who resisted the Crusaders, the Franks, as he called them. His celebrated history tells of the spirited Turkish leader of Antioch, Yagisiyan.
Yagisiyan, the ruler of Antioch, showed unparalleled wisdom and courage, strength and judgment. If all the Franks who died attacking his city had survived, they would have overrun all the lands of Islam.
Ibn al-Athir would recount how Yagisiyan, a man fabled for his big hairy ears and thick grey beard, did his utmost to keep the enemy out. But he knew one of the city's Christians might be persuaded to let the Franks in.
When he heard the approach of the Franks, he was not sure how the Christian people of the city would react. So he sent all the Muslims outside the city walls to dig trenches. And the next day, he sent the Christians by themselves to do the same task. When they were ready to return home at the end of the day, he refused to allow them in. Antioch is yours, he said. But you have to leave it to me until I found out what happens between us and the Franks.
Yagisiyan believed he had made Antioch unassailable.